September 12, 1945. 7 Japanese generals in full formal dress march rigidly toward the Singapore Municipal Building. Around them stands a massive Allied honor guard, and beyond the soldiers, a jeering local crowd. On the surface, it looks like a standard end-of-war capitulation. But in reality, every step, every camera angle, and every protocol is a meticulously crafted psychological operation. The British Empire is not just accepting a military surrender, it is attempting to perfectly, obsessively reverse a single humiliating photograph taken 3.5 years earlier. The question is, why wasn't simply winning the war and physically retaking the island enough? The answer lay in a grim political reality, understood by Supreme Allied Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten and the British High Command. You cannot simply shoot your way back into imperial authority. Retaking the island by force, whether through a massive amphibious assault or a post-war occupation, might win back the physical geography, but it would not restore the shattered illusion of colonial supremacy. This is the story of one of the most deliberately engineered political spectacles of the Second World War. It is the story of a wounded empire, treating a formal military ceremony not just as a legal conclusion to combat, but as a weapon of mass communication. Mountbatten recognized that the populations of Southeast Asia had watched the absolute power of the British Empire collapse in real time. The myth of permanent European military invincibility in Asia had been utterly destroyed. To govern again, the British had to systematically overwrite that visual trauma, frame by frame. The return had to be seen. But how do you erase a profound historical humiliation through pure stagecraft? Why did the precise choreography of this new surrender, where the cameras were placed, who was pulled from the shadows of captivity to stand witness, and exactly how the defeated generals were forced to walk, matter so desperately to the men directing it? And the ultimate question, could a carefully scripted parade ever truly wipe away the memory of an empire forced to its knees? To grasp the magnitude of the obsession that drove British planners in the autumn of 1945, you first have to understand the scale of the wound they were trying to heal. You must look at what exactly died in Singapore 3 years earlier. To stand on the Bukit Timah Road on the late afternoon of February 15th, 1942, was to witness the sudden, catastrophic end of an era. The air over Singapore was thick with the suffocating stench of burning oil, pulverized concrete, and cordite. A black canopy of smoke blotted out the tropical sun, casting an unnatural twilight over the ruined streets. This was the undisputed crown jewel of the British Empire in the East, a sprawling naval base and heavily publicized fortress known globally as the impregnable Gibraltar of the Orient. Yet, in just 70 days, a fast, lightly equipped Japanese force had swept down the Malayan Peninsula, unhinging every British defensive assumption, outflanking static positions through the jungle, and finally pushing the exhausted defenders back onto the island itself. Now, the island was dying. The critical water supply for 1 million trapped civilians and soldiers had completely failed. The reservoirs captured, or the mains shattered by relentless artillery fire. Anti-aircraft ammunition was practically gone. The fortress had not held for years, or even months. It had crumbled in a matter of weeks. The sheer velocity of the collapse induced a profound psychological paralysis among the defenders. In this apocalyptic atmosphere, Lieutenant-General Arthur Percival, the general officer commanding Malaya, made a decision that would haunt the British Empire for the rest of its existence. Dressed in a standard tropical khaki service uniform and a steel helmet, his angular face deeply lined with exhaustion, Percival stepped out to do the unthinkable. Accompanied by a small, somber group of staff officers, he walked down the Bukit Timah Road carrying a white flag. They marched alongside a Union Jack, also carried by a staff officer, not as a symbol of defiance, but as an identifier of the defeated. The visual alone was a seismic shock. For over a century, the British had projected an aura of absolute, unquestioned authority across Asia. The entire colonial system relied heavily on this carefully maintained illusion. The idea that European military power was a fundamental law of nature, immune to the challenges of the people it governed. Now, the highest-ranking British officer in Southeast Asia was walking on foot through the debris of his own shattered defenses to ask an Asian commander for terms. And waiting for him at the end of this grim procession were the cameras. The destination was the Ford Motor Factory, a requisitioned industrial plant whose boardroom had been hastily arranged by the Japanese for the occasion. Waiting inside was Lieutenant-General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the aggressive, hard-driving commander of the Japanese 25th Army. Yamashita understood perfectly well that this was not just a military transaction, it was a theater of dominance. When Percival and his officers sat down at the narrow table, the room was incredibly tense, packed tightly with Japanese officers, journalists, and photographers capturing every possible angle of the humiliated British command. Percival, hoping to negotiate conditions and perhaps salvage some shred of military dignity, found a wall of pure aggression. Yamashita did not want to negotiate. He wanted a spectacle of total, unconditional submission. Frustrated by translation delays and secretly aware that his own forces were dangerously low on ammunition and supplies, Yamashita weaponized his demeanor. He slammed his fist on the table and pointed fiercely at the British general. Through the tense, claustrophobic air of the boardroom, the demand was distilled into a brutal, binary ultimatum. Yamashita leaned forward, staring down the British commander, and demanded to know if the British army would surrender immediately, yes or no. The asymmetry of power in that room was absolute. Percival, devoid of leverage, devoid of water for his men, and cornered by his own crumbling logistics, had no choice. The illusion of imperial leverage was gone. He quietly answered, yes. With that single word, the physical defense of Singapore ended, and a massive human tragedy began. More than 80,000 Commonwealth troops, British, Australian, and Indian soldiers were ordered to lay down their arms and march into captivity. Combined with the tens of thousands already lost or captured during the disastrous retreat down the Malayan Peninsula, the sheer volume of prisoners was staggering. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news with profound shock. He would later immortalize the fall of Singapore in his memoirs, describing it flatly as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. The geopolitical reality was even darker than Churchill's private despair. The men who surrendered that day were marched off to a brutal, uncertain fate. They would be shoved into the sprawling, squalid confines of the Changi prisoner of war camp, starved, beaten, and eventually dispersed as slave labor across the Japanese Empire. Percival himself would be stripped of his command, separated from his men, and shipped off to endure years of harsh internment, eventually ending up in Manchuria. But the true catastrophe for the British Empire was not the loss of the physical real estate. Geography can be fought for, bombed, and retaken. The lethal, irreversible blow was the photographic evidence of the humiliation. The Japanese propaganda machine immediately broadcasted the images of Percival's surrender across the globe. Film reels and photographs of the gaunt, bewildered British officers sitting subserviently before Yamashita, and endless columns of European soldiers marching into captivity under the rifles of their Asian conquerors, flooded newspapers and cinemas from Tokyo to Berlin. More importantly, these images deeply penetrated the newly occupied territories of Southeast Asia. The myth of European invincibility was not just broken, it was captured on celluloid and distributed as undeniable proof. The colonial subjects who had lived under British rule saw with their own eyes that the supposedly untouchable masters could be beaten, humiliated, and marched away. The invisible architecture of imperial prestige, the psychological dominance that allowed a handful of administrators to govern millions, evaporated overnight. This collapse created the absolute narrative imperative that would obsess British planners for the rest of the war. 1942 was not just a lost battle. It was a globally photographed humiliation. Therefore, the eventual British return could not just be a military victory. It also had to be seen. The erasure of 1942 required a new photograph, a new film reel, a meticulously directed counter-narrative that would overwrite the trauma of the Ford Motor Factory. For 3.5 years, that burning desire for vindication festered in the minds of the Allied command. By the late summer of 1945, the British had finally amassed the power to exact their revenge. Following the grueling, bloody reconquest of Burma, Supreme Allied Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten prepared to unleash Operation Zipper. It was designed to be a cataclysmic, amphibious invasion of the Malayan coast. The British intended to throw hundreds of ships and battle-hardened divisions at the beaches, determined to violently blast their way back into Singapore and wash away the stain of 1942 with overwhelming kinetic force. They were ready to physically crush the Japanese defenders and take the island back by the sword. But just as the immense invasion fleet prepared to sail, history abruptly intervened. In August 1945, the devastating reality of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed immediately by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war in Asia. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio broadcast announced the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. Japan capitulated entirely. For the immense British invasion force poised to strike Malaya, the sudden cessation of hostilities created an intense, unexpected strategic vacuum. Operation Zipper, the massive amphibious assault designed to violently reclaim the peninsula and ultimately Singapore, was abruptly aborted. The thousands of British and Indian troops, the naval bombardment fleets, and the squadrons of aircraft assembled to crush the Japanese defenders were suddenly left without a battlefield. The British did not have to fight for the city. They did not have to storm the beaches, navigate the dense jungle, or engage in grueling urban combat to retake the so-called impregnable fortress. The Japanese forces in Southeast Asia, remaining fully armed and occupying their fortified positions, were ordered by Tokyo to simply lay down their arms and await the arrival of the Allied forces. This unexpected, bloodless return completely shifted Lord Louis Mountbatten's primary mission. The objective transformed instantly from a violent battlefield conquest to the orchestration of high-stakes political theater. The massive military machine, built specifically for kinetic invasion and overwhelming firepower, was suddenly rendered obsolete by a political surrender. The British command was left with a profound psychological void that combat could no longer fill. Strategically, the city no longer needed to be stormed. The physical geography of Singapore was secured the moment the emperor spoke. But psychologically, the deep, festering wound of February 1942 remained wide open. The sudden lack of a violent reckoning meant that the British could not simply demonstrate their renewed military supremacy through the destruction of the enemy. They could not point to a shattered Japanese army as proof of imperial restoration. The conflict had moved entirely from the physical battlefield to the realm of perception and memory. Mountbatten realized that if the British simply sailed into the harbor and quietly assumed control, the populations of Southeast Asia would remember only the humiliating collapse of 1942, followed by a quiet, bureaucratic transition handed down from Tokyo. The absence of a fight demanded a completely different kind of victory. It required a staged, highly visible spectacle that could somehow achieve what a naval bombardment could not: the complete public erasure of the idea that the British Empire had been permanently defeated. The mechanism for this erasure began in the early days of September 1945, as a massive Allied armada cut its way through the warm waters of the Malacca Strait. This was the spearhead of Operation Tide Race. Originally conceived as the naval vanguard for a violently contested amphibious invasion, the fleet now sailed in a surreal, heavy silence. Cruisers, destroyers, minesweepers, and troop transports, packed with battle-hardened soldiers and enough ordnance to level a city, moved steadily toward the southern tip of the Malayan Peninsula. For the naval commanders standing on the bridges of these warships, the approach was incredibly tense. They were sailing directly into the teeth of one of the most heavily fortified naval bases on the planet. The coastal batteries of Singapore, the underwater minefields, and the entrenched artillery positions that had been prepared to bleed the British invasion force dry were all still there, fully operational and fully manned. Yet, not a single shot was fired. The massive guns remained silent, their barrels pointing uselessly out to sea as the British warships dropped anchor in Keppel Harbor. Before a single combat boot touched the docks of the city, the psychological dismantling of the Japanese command began. On September 4th, the British heavy cruiser HMS Sussex sat anchored in the harbor, projecting cold steel authority. It was here, in the austere wardroom of the warship, that the first act of Mountbatten's orchestrated reversal took place. The Japanese High Command in Singapore, led by General Seishiro Itagaki of the 7th Area Army and Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, were ordered to board the British vessel to receive the preliminary terms of occupation. The staging of this encounter was deliberately designed to invert the power dynamic of the Ford Motor Factory. 3.5 years earlier, Arthur Percival had been forced to march to a Japanese-held building to beg for terms. Now, the senior Japanese commanders were ferried out to a British warship, forced to climb the gangway, and made to stand before Allied officers who offered no negotiations, no compromises, and no warmth. Inside the wardroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly formal. The British officers, flanked by armed Royal Marines, dictated the logistical realities of the occupation to men who, just weeks earlier, had held absolute power over millions of lives. Every interaction was designed to strip away the facade of Japanese imperial authority. According to accounts of the early occupation, this shift in power permeated even the most basic concepts of reality, down to the measurement of time itself. During the occupation, the Japanese had legally erased Singapore, renaming it Sionanto, the Light of the South, and had forced the entire territory to operate on Tokyo Standard Time, aligning the conquered city with the heart of the empire. During the meticulous coordination of the landing schedules, a Japanese officer reportedly referenced the hour using the imposed imperial time zone. A British officer coldly corrected him, stating flatly that they did not keep Tokyo time there. It was a minor logistical exchange, but the implication was absolute. The rules of reality were reverting. The occupation was over. The following morning, on September 5th, the physical reclamation of the island began. The ramps of the landing craft dropped, and Commonwealth forces poured onto the docks. But the British Empire did not return to Singapore as a purely European conqueror. The forces stepping ashore were heavily comprised of battle-hardened Indian troops, most notably the veterans of the 5th Indian Division. The visual impact of these specific soldiers marching through the streets of Singapore was a devastating blow to years of meticulously crafted Japanese propaganda. Throughout the war, Tokyo had relentlessly broadcasted the narrative that the British Empire was collapsing from within, that the British Indian Army was a hollow shell, and that the Asian subjects of the empire were rising up to join the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Japanese had actively recruited captured Indian soldiers into the Indian National Army to fight against the British. But here, disembarking in perfect military order, gripping their Lee Enfield rifles and moving with the disciplined confidence of men who had just annihilated the Japanese army in the jungles of Burma, were the Indian soldiers of the 14th Army. They had broken the Japanese siege at Imphal, fought through the mud of Kohima, and driven the Emperor's forces out of Rangoon. Their presence on the streets of Singapore actively dismantled the narrative that European colonial power had lost its most vital military asset. For the Japanese forces stationed on the island, the arrival of the Commonwealth troops triggered a profound cognitive dissonance. There were still tens of thousands of fully armed Japanese soldiers occupying defensive positions, barracks, and logistical hubs across Singapore and southern Malaya. They had not been defeated in combat on this ground. They had not been outmaneuvered or forced to surrender by a lack of ammunition. They had simply been ordered by their emperor to stop fighting. As the British and Indian troops fanned out to secure the strategic checkpoints of the city, the Japanese found themselves in an agonizing, unprecedented position. The men who had considered themselves the undisputed, invincible masters of Southeast Asia were suddenly ordered by their own high command to stand down and actively facilitate the arrival of their former victims. The anxiety among the Japanese officer corps was immense. They were forced to act as traffic cops, quartermasters, and security guards for the invading Allied army. Japanese commanders had to organize transport trucks, clear roadways, and maintain local order, all while heavily armed Commonwealth soldiers watched their every move. The humiliation of the situation was absolute. Japanese sentries, still clutching their Arisaka rifles, stood rigidly at attention as columns of British and Indian troops marched past them, taking control of the city block by block. The Japanese soldiers, who had been conditioned to believe that surrender was the ultimate spiritual failure and that death in combat was the only honorable outcome, were now trapped in a bureaucratic capitulation, forced to witness their own authority evaporate without firing a single shot. As the combat troops pushed deeper into the island, the operation quickly transformed from a tense military occupation into a horrifying rescue mission. Allied units were dispatched immediately to secure the prisoner of war and civilian internment camps, the most infamous of which was Changi. When the gates of Changi were finally thrown open, the hardened veterans of the Burma campaign were brought face to face with the grim, unfiltered reality of the Japanese occupation. The troops did not find the defeated army of 1942. They found thousands of walking skeletons. The emaciated POWs, wrapped in rotting rags and suffering from severe malnutrition, malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers, stepped out of the shadows to greet their liberators. These were the men who had surrendered at the Ford Motor Factory, the men who had been marched away into the dark while the world watched. Many of the prisoners at Changi were survivors of the Burma-Thailand Railway, the notorious Death Railway, who had been shipped back to Singapore after surviving years of systemic brutality and forced labor that had killed tens of thousands of their comrades. The sheer physical devastation of the prisoners was a shock to the arriving soldiers. Medical teams were rushed in, and military logistics were instantly redirected to provide emergency rations, clean water, and medical care. The sight of these starving men, weeping at the sight of the Allied uniforms, permanently hardened the attitude of the occupying forces toward their Japanese captives. The abstract concept of a political surrender was immediately eclipsed by the visceral human tragedy standing before them. The discovery of the camps also ignited the broader civilian population of Singapore. For 3.5 years, the local Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities had lived under a regime of constant terror. The crowd that was beginning to gather in the streets, watching the British return, was not merely cheering for a change in administration. They were boiling with a deep, unresolved trauma. The occupation of Singapore had been defined by extreme violence, most notably the Sukching massacres that occurred in the immediate aftermath of the 1942 surrender. In an effort to eliminate any potential anti-Japanese resistance, the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, had systematically screened the Chinese population of Singapore, loaded thousands of men onto trucks, and executed them on the beaches of Changi and Punggol. For years, the civilian population had endured forced labor, severe food shortages, hyperinflation, and the constant paralyzing fear of the Kempeitai interrogators. Now, with the sudden arrival of the Allied fleet, that dam of suppressed terror broke, transforming into roaring public anger. The city became a volatile powder keg. On one side were tens of thousands of armed Japanese soldiers, humiliated, confused, and deeply anxious about their fate. On the other side were heavily armed Commonwealth combat troops, increasingly furious as they uncovered the horrific realities of the POW camps. And surrounding them both was a massive civilian population demanding justice and retribution for years of unchecked brutality. It was a situation that could easily have devolved into massive urban bloodshed, revenge killings, and widespread chaos. This was the incredibly dangerous, highly charged atmosphere into which Supreme Allied Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived. As he surveyed the tactical and political landscape of the city, Mountbatten understood that the situation required a masterful display of control. A quiet, bureaucratic signing of surrender documents in a closed room or on the deck of a warship, similar to the ceremony General Douglas MacArthur had just orchestrated on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, would not be enough for Singapore. A private surrender would fail to release the immense psychological pressure building in the city. It would fail to demonstrate to the traumatized local population that the Kempeitai were truly powerless. And most importantly, it would fail to achieve the primary political objective, the public, undeniable erasure of the 1942 humiliation. Mountbatten realized that this ceremony could not just be a vanity project. It had to be a meticulously controlled public reckoning. He began dictating the precise choreography of the surrender with the obsessiveness of a theatrical director. Every single element of the event was engineered to project absolute, unyielding British authority and to force the Japanese command into a posture of total visible subjugation. He selected the municipal building, known today as City Hall, as the stage. It was a massive neoclassical structure with towering Corinthian columns and a wide flight of stone steps leading up to the entrance. Directly in front of the building lay the Padang, a sprawling open field that could hold tens of thousands of spectators. It was the perfect architectural amphitheater for an imperial resurrection. Mountbatten ordered that the Padang be surrounded by a massive, overwhelming display of Allied military might. He positioned guards of honor from the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, the Australian Armed Forces, and the battle-hardened Indian Army. The troops were ordered to stand in rigid, flawless formations, their bayonets fixed and gleaming in the harsh tropical sun, creating an impenetrable wall of Commonwealth discipline. He then dictated the exact path the Japanese delegation would be forced to take. They would not be quietly escorted through a back door. They would be forced to arrive in front of the Padang, step out of their vehicles in their full, formal dress uniforms, and walk on foot across the pavement. They would have to pass directly in front of the massive, jeering civilian crowd, the very people they had brutally governed for 3 years. They would then have to climb the long flight of stone steps to the municipal building, flanked on both sides by towering Allied soldiers who would look down upon them. Every agonizing step of their approach would be captured by pre-positioned British photographers and newsreel cameramen, ensuring that the image of Japanese subjugation was recorded from every possible angle. The pressure on the British command to execute this flawlessly was immense. In a city held by an armed enemy that had not been militarily defeated on the ground, combined with the horrifying discovery of the POW camps and the boiling rage of the civilian population, the slightest miscalculation could trigger a massacre. Mountbatten needed strict, uncompromising discipline from his men. There could be no spontaneous acts of violence against the Japanese delegates, no rioting in the crowd that the military could not control, and no deviation from the script. The spectacle of the returning empire relied entirely on the projection of absolute, calm, mechanical order. Mountbatten had the stage set. He had the massive audience of local civilians and liberated prisoners ready to watch. He had the defeated enemy commanders isolated, disarmed of their authority, and prepared to walk the gauntlet. He had the cameras loaded and the honor guards locked at attention. The architecture of the ceremony was perfectly designed to visually crush the Japanese high command in front of the world. But as he finalized the choreography of the September 12th surrender, Mountbatten knew that military pageantry and rigid formations were only half the equation. To make the psychological reversal absolute, to truly overwrite the trauma that had shattered the Empire's prestige, he needed something more than just fresh combat troops and rolling film cameras. He needed a direct, undeniable link to the darkest day in British military history. To cure the specific wound of the Ford Motor Factory, he had to reach into the shadows of the newly opened prison camps and resurrect the ghosts of 1942. To achieve an absolute psychological reversal, the British needed physical artifacts of their survival. They found the first inside the sprawling, squalid confines of the Changi prison complex. When the city fell in February 1942, a Union Jack had been quietly struck and smuggled away by captured soldiers. For 3.5 years, concealing an Allied flag was a severe offense, an act of quiet defiance that would have invited brutal interrogation by the Kempeitai. Yet the prisoners of war had carefully hidden it, preserving the cloth through years of disease, starvation, and relentless forced labor. Now, in September 1945, this tattered, faded piece of fabric was brought out into the light. Mountbatten ordered that this specific flag, not a crisp, newly manufactured standard carried off a battleship, but the very flag that had endured the darkness of the occupation, would be the one hoisted over the city. It was a tangible link, connecting the exact moment of defeat directly to the moment of liberation. But a piece of cloth cannot look a conqueror in the eye. To truly wipe away the photograph of the Ford Motor Factory, the British had to bring back the man in the photograph. Just weeks earlier, Lieutenant-General Arthur Percival was a starving, physically broken prisoner locked away in an internment camp in Manchuria, entirely cut off from the outside world. He remained the living embodiment of Britain's deepest humiliation. However, the Allied command understood the immense narrative power of defeated commanders. General Douglas MacArthur had specifically pulled Percival out of captivity to stand behind him during the primary Japanese capitulation on the deck of the USS Missouri. Seeing an opportunity for his own theater, Mountbatten demanded Percival be brought to Singapore. The British rushed the frail, gaunt general from Tokyo Bay directly to Malaya. Moving a recently freed, heavily traumatized man across the Pacific Theater was an intense logistical effort, but the symbolic necessity overrode any medical concerns. Returning Percival to the exact site of his greatest historical shame carried a profound personal weight. He was not being flown back to issue orders or command divisions. He was brought back for one devastating purpose: to stand behind the Japanese generals and watch them submit. Mountbatten wanted the defeated enemy command to walk into the surrender, expecting to face only the victorious officers of 1945, only to find themselves staring into the hollow, surviving eyes of the man they had crushed 3 years prior. The stage was now perfectly constructed. The massive crowds of liberated civilians and former prisoners were gathering, their anger radiating in the heavy tropical heat. The tattered flag of Changi was prepared for the halyards, and the ghost of 1942 had returned to take his proper place. The British had built their time machine, and the ultimate theatrical reversal was finally ready to play out under the lenses of the global press. At precisely 10:30 on the morning of September 12th, the heavy doors of the municipal building were thrown open. Lord Louis Mountbatten, dressed in an immaculate white Royal Navy uniform, stood at the top of the grand stone steps. Below him, the vast expanse of the Padang was flooded with tens of thousands of people. Liberated prisoners of war, still wearing the ragged uniforms they had worn behind barbed wire, stood alongside local civilians who had survived years of Kempeitai interrogations and severe rationing. The air was incredibly tense, completely silent, except for the harsh snap of military orders as the Allied honor guards locked into position. Then the motorcade arrived. General Seishiro Itagaki, representing the absent Yamashita, and 6 other senior Japanese commanders stepped out of their staff cars. They were wearing their full olive-drab dress uniforms, polished high boots, and white gloves, their ceremonial katanas hanging heavily at their sides. This was the moment the British command had obsessively engineered. The Japanese generals were forced to begin their long, deliberate walk. As they moved across the pavement, the silence of the Padang suddenly shattered. The massive crowd erupted into a deafening roar of jeers, whistles, and outright hostility. The men who had ruled Singapore with absolute, terrifying authority for 3.5 years were now marching through a gauntlet of raw, uncontained civilian rage. The Japanese delegation kept their faces entirely expressionless, marching rigidly forward, staring straight ahead as they climbed the stone steps, passing directly beneath the towering Commonwealth soldiers looking down at them. Inside the municipal building chamber, the psychological theater reached its devastating conclusion. The room was packed with Allied officers and a battery of international press photographers, their camera flashes illuminating the tense, claustrophobic air. When the Japanese generals took their seats at the surrender table, they looked across and saw Mountbatten waiting for them. But the true shock came from the men standing immediately behind him. Standing perfectly still in the second row was Arthur Percival. He was frail, his uniform hanging loosely on his emaciated frame, his face deeply lined from years of starvation and captivity. But he was there, the Japanese commanders, expecting to surrender only to the victorious officers of the Burma campaign, suddenly found themselves staring into the hollow, unblinking eyes of the very man they had broken in 1942. Percival did not speak. He did not need to. His physical presence in that room was a silent, crushing dismantling of everything the Japanese military had claimed to achieve. Mountbatten dictated the terms with cold, mechanical efficiency. There was no negotiation. There were no demands for a yes or no. The documents were placed on the table, and one by one, the Japanese commanders signed away their conquests, their authority, and their empire. As the final signature was inked, the roar of a military band echoed from the Padang outside. The cameras rolled as the Japanese generals were formally ordered to remove their ceremonial swords and lay them on the table. The ultimate symbol of samurai authority, the weapons they had carried as conquerors, were quietly handed over to the officers of the British Empire. And high above the city, catching the humid tropical breeze, the tattered, faded Union Jack of Changi was finally run up the flagpole. The photograph of the Ford Motor Factory had been perfectly, flawlessly reversed. Yet, as the last notes of the military band faded over the Padang and the international press hurried to wire their perfectly framed photographs back to London, a profound political reality remained unaltered beneath the surface of the spectacle. The British command had flawlessly executed their obsessive psychological operation. They had meticulously erased the imagery of February 1942, replacing the humiliated Percival walking under a white flag with the rigid Japanese generals marching through a hostile gauntlet. But they could not erase the 3.5 years that had passed between those two photographs. The fundamental architecture of colonial rule, the absolute, unquestioned belief in European invincibility, had been shattered, and a carefully choreographed parade could not put it back together. Standing amidst the vast, jeering crowd outside the municipal building was a 22-year-old law student named Lee Kuan Yew, who would eventually become the founding prime minister of an independent Singapore. He was not looking at the ceremony with the profound relief of the returning British administrators. He, like millions of others across Southeast Asia, was watching the event through the hardened lens of a population that had survived the catastrophic failure of its protectors. The local civilians had watched the supposedly impregnable fortress crumble in 70 days. They had witnessed the absolute collapse of the British military apparatus, and they had endured the brutal, terrifying reality of the Japanese occupation, while the colonial authorities sat in captivity. Mountbatten could force General Itagaki to climb the stone steps. The returning Allied armies could reclaim the naval base, open the gates of Changi, and eventually pursue accountability through war crimes trials. The geography of the fortress had been successfully retaken. But the elaborate political theater of September 12th, as perfectly staged as it was, collided with the irreversible psychological awakening of a deeply changed population. The people of Singapore and the wider region had seen the empire bleed. They had seen the masters defeated, driven out, and humiliated. The British could raise the hidden flag and dictate the terms of surrender, but the foundational aura of colonial supremacy was dead. The ceremony successfully flipped the photograph, but it could not alter the fact that the people of Asia now knew that European power was finite, fallible, and ultimately temporary. In February 1942, Arthur Percival walked slowly down a debris-filled road toward his conquerors, carrying a white flag to surrender an empire. In September 1945, 7 Japanese generals walked rigidly toward Lord Louis Mountbatten, surrendering their own conquests, while a tattered British flag rose triumphantly above the exact same city. The capitulation had been meticulously reversed, almost frame for perfect frame. The conquerors had been transformed into the surrendering officers. The starving prisoners of war had been elevated to the role of silent, watchful witnesses, and an abandoned, burning colony had been repurposed as a grand stage for imperial victory. By sheer force of political will, Britain took Singapore back. But what it could never take back, and what no carefully choreographed parade could ever resurrect, was the illusion that it could never lose it.